And so it makes a nice collar that is not bulky on the ends. And so Louise Cutting puts this in her patterns.
Oh, does she?
Her pattern is already, that's her pattern piece.
What is that?
That's a collar. Believe it or not, that's a collar. Now I'm going to show you how it works. And what you have to do, I should have used black to draw. Trace your pattern.
Yeah. What piece is that?
This is a collar. This is a collar. Trace your collar, the whole thing. If you only have one that's like this, trace two. You don't want to mess with your original pattern. So trace off your collar. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take your collar and you're going to mark seam allowances on the front edges. And then you're going to cut it apart at the fold line. So you have two pieces. Okay? What did I do with my pins? I just have them right here. I got them. So what you do is you take your front seam lines and you match up your dots. You know how the dot tells you this is a corner. You're going to match up your dots. And since I drew it on tissue paper, I can see my seam lines and I can stack them on top of each other. Okay, so now you have this kind of funny looking thing. Okay, one end you need to write fold line. Okay, very important. The next thing you do is you add a seam allowance to the other end. Okay? Does not matter which end. Because this was your center back line. Okay, so now you have this pattern piece, which you can cut out. And you're going to put this on the fold. And you're going to end up with this bizarro looking thing. You want to make sure that you mark with little clips this line here and this line here, so you know where for sure to fold it. And you want to mark your notches, and in the case of the fold you want to have a notch so that that's going to be a center line, center front line. So now you're ready to cut out, and you want to cut it out on the fold of the fabric. So you're going to end up with a piece that looks like this. So the next thing, and you know, Nancy Zeman, she was some kind of something. And this book is from a long time ago. And this is the method that she goes through and step by step shows you how to make this one-piece collar.
So it was really Nancy Zeman.
No, I think it's been several people that have done it. But in her book, she's so precise, and I love her descriptions of things. So anyway, she tells you exactly. But one of the little hints that I had completely forgotten until I got a hold of the book again was her hint for making a pattern for the interfacing, because you don't want the interfacing in all your seams because it's bulky. So what she suggests you do is take your pattern, put it under a piece of wax paper, pin it so it doesn't go all crazy, lay it down. She suggests a padded surface. Everybody has one of these little babies. Metal one works best, I will tell you that. Set it at 1/2 inch, because almost all our patterns are 5/8. That'll give you that little bit, 1/8 inch, to go in the seam lines. Then what you do is you put this seam gauge on your wax paper and you trace around your pattern. I mean, she was so good. And then you cut it out and you have a pattern that is for your interfacing.
Oh,
Is that not cool?
that's very clever. Very clever.
And we all have these things. And so then you can save this, and it's different, so you know what you're interfacing.
I wondered what I was going to do with my wax paper.
I use it for lots of things. But anyway, it's the coolest thing. I'll let you pass that around so you can see.
Clever idea.
But I mean, it's so cool. So, now you would go ahead and iron your interfacing on. I did not. I did not iron any interfacing. Yeah, here's one. She's in, now you have to interface the whole collar, so you want to use a real lightweight because of the fact that you really have a not defined edge here. And you don't want a little bit turned under, so you want to interface the whole thing with a light interfacing. Okay, one thing that Louise Cutting does that I think is wonderful, especially with this Bizarro piece, is match it back up to your pattern before you go any farther to make sure in all your handling you haven't gotten it out of shape. Okay, so now, that's right. Okay, so now you're going to take your ends and you're going to make your, you're going to sew your seam allowance just like you would, right sides together. Okay, so now I've sewed and I'm going to press my seam open. So now you have a collar that has no seams on the ends. Your center front line will match up with this seam line. Your nips should match when you fold it flat. So now what you'll do is you'll sew the outside edge seam and you clip your corners and turn it right side in. And if you're not going to do any edge stitching or anything, you want to probably do some under stitching. But you end up with a very nice no bulk collar. So anyway, you can pass all these things around so you can see. Well, the next part of this discussion then becomes, we've learned all these inspirational things for making a shirt. And I love a good challenge. I do. It's just one of my favorite things, to have a reason to try something.
It's got an embellishment with the under collar wrapped to the front of the collar. So that's kind of what's happening here. So conceptually, what you do is you take your under collar, and you can see from this how it's much bigger than the top collar. In this case, this is a small collar, and I wanted a larger collar because this is actually one, I'll show you my pieces of one that I'm actually really working on. And so I just made the under collar bigger, and I made it by an inch because I wanted an effect that looked like this. So you can kind of see, if you want this much, you need about an inch extra on the under collar, because by the time you wrap it around and you put your bias tape on it and yaddy-hoo, you just need extra space. If the collar was already the width that you wanted it, obviously you'd have to take it off of the upper collar so that once you wrapped it, it would be the same size. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, because basically I still have the seam allowance of, I've got the seam allowance extra of my upper collar. That's how much extra width I got out of this collar. Does that make sense? Okay, so all you do whenever you're doing this, once you've got your pieces cut, I've interfaced my upper collar, and I lay it on top of the under collar, and I press the under collar up and over the upper collar. Okay, so I've just pressed it up over it. I'm not going to sew those two pieces together with a seam. I'm just going to press it over like that. And then I take my bias tape and I lay it on top of the join where that comes together, or where it overlaps. And then I'm just going to stitch it down on both sides, just like you would a bias tape.
Do you sew through all layers or just the?
No, you're doing this, so you're doing this, you flip this open so that, yeah, so you don't see anything on the back. But that's basically kind of how you get attach the edges. And then once you're done with that, you obviously then have to take the collar, which is just ironed along the edge. And so I just pinned it, and then you're just going to flip it back like so that you can sew your corner together. And then once you flip it around and press out your corner, this is what you've got. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So the one, just to make, so you can see it another way, this is a collar I'm currently working on. This is actually turned into the debacle shirt because, anyway, so before I pass it over to Marie, I wanted to show you, so this is that pattern. This is what I did with this little sample that I made for you guys. Is I use this same pattern, so it's my grain line. That's my favorite go-to shirt pattern. So you can see here's my upper collar, and it's cut in this case because I wanted to widen the collar exactly the same width as my pattern piece, and the under collar is cut. In this case, I wanted an extra inch, so this is an extra inch on the under collar. And then you just do exactly what I described, which is the ironing and folding and put the bias tape on top. I brought last month, I think it was, the black and white shirt that's my challenge shirt. I use this exact same method with a modification, and on that one, instead of doing this overlap, I actually changed it so that I made the seam allowance, and I put piping in that seam allowance. Nice. But it's the same concept where you press it so you know where the bottom is, and then you flip it the other way so that you know how to sew this side seam.
And tell them what thread article number it is.
Why don't I even pass that around? It's because it's the Threads May 2017, and it's called Clever Collar Construction. And
this is a technique that Maris Olson uses, who is the president of the Seattle chapter of ASG, and she was the one who presented the instructor for the shirt making workshop that we took in January. And I thought it was fabulous. So first of all, a little contrary to what Penny talked about last month, she adjusts her seam allowances ahead of time. And in the real pale, right on the very first paragraph, you'll see what her recommendations are, okay? And that's what I've done in these samples. I will tell you, I did this blouse and I didn't do that. Penny doesn't trim until the end because she wants the 5/8 of an inch to hold on to, all right? And there are times you want to hold on to, because your collar bands are pretty small, all right? So you know, holding on to just that, I don't know if you can see where they...
because you get a more accurate seam.
Mm-hmm. Well, I found I got a really accurate seam in the samples, but not in the garment, which is, you know. Also, this is one way of doing it. Penny's another way of doing it. David Page Coffin is another way. You know, there's no one right way. There's plenty of wrong ways. The 4 major pattern companies and myself have done many times the wrong way. I do like this way. It was easier to work with, all right? It's just understanding it. It's not hard, all right? So we're going to follow through on this. I want to wait till everybody gets a copy so you can see what I'm talking about. All right, so anyhow, and she also suggests, which I do even if I did the 5/8, I did do this. I trimmed all interfacing to just fit the collar band, not in the seam allowance whatsoever, all right? You don't want that bulk there, all right? This is not really good interfacing. This is just some garbagey stuff I had, so don't, you know, practice with your fabric, all right? Another thing I'm going to tell you, shirt fabric works beautifully, all right? Non-shirt fabric is not so beautiful, all right? It's a little bit tougher. Okay. Thank you, thank you. Let's see. All righty. So first off, another thing is Penny wears her collars up like this, so she calls this the public side of the collar. So if you're going to do any detail, you know, something different, she would do it here. I like to put my collars down, so obviously I'm going to do, this is my public side. We're only talking about the collar band, all right? That's all we're talking about. All right, so first off, first step, and I've got that explained right here in that second paragraph here, okay? With this method, the inside of the collar stand is the right side, all right? So if you want to reverse it, you're going to have to flip number 1, all right? You're going to, all right, but we're going to go on what we've written here, okay? So, first of all, you take your right side of your interfaced collar, okay? That's the other thing. That's the one that we interface, all right? The one that, unless you have a really limp fabric, the one that you want to show if you're going to do a contrasting, or if you wear your collars like this is the one you're going to want to interface. If you wear your collars like Penny, that's the one you're going to want to interface, okay? Generally for women's shirts, you don't really need on both. You don't need all that stiffness, all right? You're not wearing a tie, you don't need it all. Well, maybe you are, but anyway. Okay. Anybody has any questions along the way, please stop me, all right? Raise your hand. Okay. So, going back to this. There's my 1/4 inch seam, all right? My collar band, and I took my right side of my collar band to the wrong side of the fabric and just sewed that end to end. Okay, matching your notches, your center back. I find that matching center back and the ends are probably the most important thing out of everything, okay? Especially if you've trimmed it down, you go, oh, I trimmed off all my notches. You know, I do at least. Okay, now comes the tricky part. And I brought my sewing machine because I can go over this several times. And, oh, and I will pass this around. That's the first one, all right? Now you make your collar. I'm not going to talk about making the collar, but you've got a completed collar is your next step, all right? Now you're going back and you're taking that completed collar and you're attaching it right to that band that's already sewed on. Now, she says pin or baste. I always baste, all right? Hand baste, machine baste, whichever one you want to do. You want to keep it in place. If you're very good with your hands, you don't have to baste, but okay, that's not my forte. All right, then you take your collar band, your other collar band that's not interfaced, and this is the tricky part, okay? So you're going to match it up at your ends, okay? Oh, the other thing is too, you are definitely keeping your seams down. You know, a lot of times they'll tell you to press your seams up like that. I don't know if you see what I'm talking about there. Does everybody see what I'm talking about? You don't do that with this method, okay? Forget about that. You keep them down, okay? So now you've got this one, and you're putting it on here. And what you do first is you start sewing maybe about 1 inch in, all right? And you start sewing, and you sew till you come to the end, all right? Maris's trick is always to go to a really small stitch. She doesn't back stitch, all right? I thought that was a really good tip, especially when you're working with these small seam allowances. And some, you know, some machines jam. I don't know, I'm sure mine isn't the only one, okay? So you're coming around your corner and you go all the way to the end, all right? Now, this is, all right, this is the tricky part. Then you take your band. Now you've got to be sewing down this way, right? But this is the burrito method. You take your collar and you turn it in. You take your placket and you turn it in. This is the part that doesn't seem to make sense to people.
Turn both ways, Maria.
Okay, I am going to pass this around. All right, let me pin that first part here for a second, just so I can show you. So I've turned my collar in. I'm gonna hold it up, maybe people can see. And then you're going to turn your placket in, all right? Which seems counterintuitive, but it's not, all right? And your little seam allowance from attaching your collar and your collar band, the previous step, is going to show. You want that. So all you're doing is you have your collar, your new collar band, your collar. Is it the collar? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the collar. The placket seam allowance only, and the other collar band. So you've got the two collar bands with just the seam allowance of the placket in there. All right. And so you start sewing here, and you go down about an inch into the placket, all right? When you've done that, and I will pass this around, okay, that's what you get, this really funny looking thing, okay? But what happens is when you turn it inside out, this one's easier to turn. Oh, I forgot my point turner, okay? What happens is you get this, you've got just this little bit sewn here. It's all tucked in nice. Your seam allowances have already been trimmed to the 1/4 inch, so you don't have to cut anything else. And now you can take your collar band, this one, and what you're supposed to do on the outside is edge stitch all the way around. Now this is where you're going to have to, this step you're going to have to be very careful with pressing and pinning, so it gets exactly where you want it, and you just cover that seam allowance, okay, when you're doing your edge stitching. But this is what ends up happening, and it's nice and neat here in the corner. I don't know how I don't know if everybody can see what I'm talking about and understand. Yeah? Oh, good.
When it comes around then.
Okay, yeah, and when it comes around, I'm going to send these both around, all right, so you can see. So even though it looks really funny, okay, and then you just have to work this back in, all right? It's just counterintuitive to take that. The collar seems to come away, tuck in easily, but this placket doesn't. That's the part that I found the hardest to get through my little brain. So, but you keep on turning it, and then all of a sudden you're going to see that seam allowance pop around. And that's the one that you want to grab, just that. Okay? Anybody else, any questions?